Hello everyone and welcome back to your worst nightmare YouTube channel. To help us feel even more connected as a community, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you are watching from. If you would like to share some of your horror encounter, do well to email us through the description of this video. Don't forget to smash the like and subscribe button. Thanks. Now, back to today's episode. I've always been the type of person who kept their feet firmly planted in reality. The kind of guy who would scoff at the idea of the supernatural and roll his eyes at the slightest hint of any demon or ghost story. But what I experienced last fall changed that forever, and to this day, I still can't fully comprehend what happened to me. It all started with a camping trip. My two closest friends, Mike and Sam, and I had decided to take a weekend getaway into the hills a few hours outside of the city. We'd been to the same spot a few times before, a secluded clearing by a small lake, surrounded by dense woods. The place was perfect, isolated, quiet, and far away from any cell service. It was supposed to be a time to unwind, crack open a few beers, and tell stupid stories around the campfire. But this time, something felt off from the moment we arrived. The air was thicker, the shadows seemed longer, and the forest was unnervingly silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive quiet air that settled over us like a blanket. Mike joked about it, trying to lighten the mood, but even he couldn't hide the unease in his voice. As night fell, the uneasiness grew. The three of us sat around the fire, the flames casting flickering shadows on the trees. The fire crackled, and every now and then, we'd hear what sounded like a low growl in the distance, but we chalked it up to our imaginations or maybe some wild animal far off in the woods. Around midnight, just as we were starting to consider calling it a night, we heard it, a deep, guttural howl that echoed through the hills. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't a wolf or a coyote or anything that belonged in those woods. It was low, almost mournful, but there was something in it that made my skin crawl. The three of us froze, eyes wide, listening as the howl faded into the night. What the hell was that? Sam whispered, his voice trembling. Probably just some animal, Mike said, but he didn't sound convinced. We all knew it wasn't just some animal. There was something in that howl that felt wrong, like it didn't belong in this world. We tried to laugh it off, but the mood was ruined. We doused the fire and crawled into our tents, but sleep didn't come easy. I lay there, staring at the tent ceiling, listening to the night, every snap of a twig making my heart race. Then, just as I was finally drifting off, I heard it again, closer this time. The same howl, but now there was a snarling edge to it, something that sounded more angry, more desperate. I sat up, my breath catching in my throat. Through the thin fabric of the tent, I could see Mike's flashlight flick on in his tent next to mine. Sam, in the tent on the other side, muttered something, but I couldn't make out the words. And then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A low growl, right outside my tent. I froze, barely daring to breathe. The growl grew louder, more insistent, and I could hear something moving outside, something big. The sound of claws scraping against the dirt, the rustling of leaves as it circled the tent. I wanted to call out to Mike or Sam, but fear held me back. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. Whatever was out there, it wasn't an animal. I don't know how I knew that, but I did. It was something else, something malevolent, something that shouldn't exist. Then, suddenly, the growling stopped. Silence. I strained to listen, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. For a moment, I thought maybe it had gone, but then the tense fabric began to bulge inward, like something was pressing against it from the outside. I bit down on a scream, terror clawing at my throat. The bulging moved slowly along the tent, as if whatever was out there was feeling its way around, searching for a way in. And then I smelled it, a rank, putrid stench that filled the tent, making me gag. It smelled like rotting meat and wet fur, a scent so foul it burned my nostrils. I could feel tears streaming down my face as I desperately tried to stay silent, to not make a sound. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the pressure on the tent stopped. The stench lingered for a moment longer, and then I heard it again, that same howl, but this time, it was different. It was a mix of pain, anger, and something else, something like satisfaction. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. None of us did. When dawn finally broke, we stumbled out of our tents, pale and shaken. Mike's face was ashen, and Sam looked like he was going to be sick. "What the hell happened last night?" Mike asked, his voice hoarse. "I don't know," I replied, "but we need to leave. Now." We packed up in record time, not saying much, just moving on autopilot, driven by a primal need to get out of there. As we loaded the last of our gear into the truck, I noticed something on the ground near where our tents had been. At first, I thought it was just a patch of dark earth, but when I looked closer, I realized it was a footprint. No, not just one, but several, all around the campsite. They were huge, much bigger than any animal's tracks I'd ever seen, and they were deep, as if whatever made them was impossibly heavy. And then I saw something else, something that made my stomach churn. On one of the trees near the edge of the clearing, there were deep gouges, like claw marks, cutting through the bark. But they were too high up, at least 7 feet off the ground, and there were bits of fur stuck in the sap. It was coarse and dark, unlike any animal fur I'd ever seen. Without a word, we jumped into the truck and sped away, leaving the hills behind as fast as we could. None of us said anything for a long time, the silence only broken by the sound of the tires on the gravel road. It's been months since that night, and I've tried to forget, tried to convince myself it was just some weird animal, maybe a bear or something, but deep down, I know that's not true. There was something in those hills, something ancient and evil, something that didn't belong in our world. I used to live in a quiet suburban neighborhood where nothing much ever happened. The houses were all cookie-cutter copies, the lawns meticulously trimmed, and the people minding their own business. It was the kind of place where you'd wave to your neighbor every morning, and they'd nod back, perhaps with a half-hearted smile. But beyond that, no one really knew each other. It was perfect for me, at least, it had been until that night. The incident happened in early October, just as the leaves began to turn brown and the air became cold. I remember it clearly because it was the night I started hearing the barking. I had always been a light sleeper, so when the barking started, I woke immediately. It wasn't unusual to hear dogs in the neighborhood, but this was different, more urgent, more frantic. I could tell it wasn't just one dog. Multiple barks echoed through the night, a chaotic chorus that seemed to be coming from every direction. I checked the clock, 3:14 a.m. The neighborhood was usually dead silent at that hour. Annoyed, I pulled the blanket over my head, trying to block out the noise. But it grew louder, more intense. My heart began to race as I felt fear creeping into my chest. The barking wasn't just loud, it was desperate. Unable to ignore it any longer, I got out of bed and walked to the window. Peeking through the blinds, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. The streetlights cast a strange glow over the empty street, but no dogs were in sight. Yet, the barking persisted, more louder than ever. Then, I noticed something strange, shadows moving in the yards across the street. They were low to the ground, shifting, walking between trees and bushes. Squinting my eyes, I tried to make out what they were, but they were too fast for me. My breath caught in my throat as I realized they were moving closer, gathering toward a single point, the old abandoned lot at the end of the street. My curiosity got the better of me. Throwing on a jacket, I grabbed my phone and quietly slipped out the front door. The air was cold, and my breath misted in front of me as I crept down the sidewalk. The barking had stopped immediately, leaving a strange silence. All I could hear now were my footsteps on the pavement and the distant hum of the highway. As I neared the abandoned lot, I saw them, dogs, dozens of them, standing perfectly still in a tight circle. They were all different breeds, some familiar from the neighborhood, others I had never seen before. Their eyes glowed in the darkness, reflecting the dim light from the street lamps. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I realized they were all facing inward, focused on something I couldn't see. I stopped several yards away, heart pounding in my chest. My instinct screamed at me to turn around and leave, but something compelled me to stay. Slowly, I lifted my phone, hitting record. The camera's lens captured the strange scene, the dogs standing like statues, their breaths visible in the cool night air. Then, without warning, the dogs began to move. It wasn't a gradual change. They all stepped forward simultaneously, as if responding to an unseen command. I moved closer, my eyes straining to see what they were circling. Suddenly, I saw it, an object in the center of the circle. It was small, partially buried in the dirt, but as the dogs moved aside, I caught a glimpse of it. My stomach turned as I realized what it was, a human hand, pale and lifeless, fingers curled as if grasping for something just out of reach. I gasped, stumbling backward, and the sound drew the dog's attention. Dozens of glowing eyes snapped toward me, and a low growl came from the pack. Panic surged through me, and I turned to run, but my legs felt heavy, almost like they were stuck in place. My mind raced as I struggled to make sense of what I had just seen. How long had that hand been there? Who did it belong to? And why were the dogs acting this way? Before I could move, a sharp whistle cut through the air, piercing the silence. The dogs froze, their growls fading into silence. I looked around frantically, trying to find the source of the whistle, but there was no one in sight. Just the dogs, the darkened street, and the growing fear in my chest. Then, as if on cue, the dogs began to leave. They moved quietly, one by one, slinking back into the shadows, disappearing into the night as if nothing had happened. Within moments, the lot was empty, the hand partially covered by the disturbed earth. I stood there, paralyzed by fear and confusion, unsure of what to do. My phone was still recording, the footage capturing the empty lot and the faint sound of my ragged breathing. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but who would believe me? It sounded insane, dozens of dogs gathering around a buried hand in the middle of the night. Summoning what little courage I had left, I forced myself to approach the lot. My hands trembled as I crouched down, using my phone's flashlight to illuminate the area. The hand was still there, fingers slightly visible beneath the dirt. I couldn't bring myself to touch it. Instead, I ran. I sprinted back to my house, slammed the door shut, and bolted it behind me. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt, and my mind was spinning with questions. I played back the video on my phone, half expecting it to be blank or worse, show something I hadn't seen. But it was all there, the dogs, the hand, everything. The next morning, the police were at the lot. A neighbor had called after noticing the disturbed earth. They uncovered a body, an adult male, but no one knew who he was or how he had ended up there. The dogs, of course, were gone, and no one seemed to have seen them that night but me. The video went viral, shared thousands of times, with people speculating about what really happened. But I never found any answers, just more questions. The dogs never returned, and the neighborhood went back to its quiet, uneventful routine. But I knew better. Something had changed that night, something I couldn't explain, something I didn't want to understand. My husband, Mark, and I had just hired a new babysitter, a quiet, responsible girl named Emily. She was perfect, always on time, polite, and our kids, Lily and Jacob, adored her. She would often send us short video clips while we were out, showing the kids playing or doing crafts. It gave us peace of mind, knowing they were happy and safe. One night, while Mark and I were out celebrating our anniversary, Emily sent us a video. We were in the middle of dinner, laughing over some shared memory, when my phone buzzed. I opened the message and saw a clip of Lily and Jacob sitting at the kitchen table, drawing. Emily's voice could be heard in the background, asking them about their pictures. It was cute, just another little snippet of their evening. But something about the video felt off. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. I played it back a few times, trying to identify what was bothering me. Mark noticed my distraction and asked what was wrong, but I shrugged it off. Nothing, I said, tucking my phone away. Just a feeling. When we got home later that night, the kids were already in bed, and Emily was tidying up the living room. I thanked her, paid her, and she left with her usual shy smile. Everything seemed normal. But that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. The next morning, I watched the video again. I don't know why. I guess I was trying to convince myself that everything was fine. But the more I watched, the more uneasy I felt. It wasn't just a mother's instinct. There was something wrong, something subtle that I couldn't quite catch. Then, in a flash, I saw it. In the background, behind the children, there was a shadow. At first glance, it looked like a trick of the light, just a dark shape on the wall. But as I slowed down the video and watched carefully, I realized it wasn't a shadow at all. It was a figure, a tall, dark figure standing just outside the frame, barely visible. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but it was there, looming over my children. I felt my heart drop into my stomach. My first thought was that someone had broken into the house, that there had been an intruder there while my children played, completely unaware. But there was no way that could be true. Emily would have noticed, right? She would have said something. And besides, there was no sign of a break-in, no missing items, nothing out of place. I showed the video to Mark, hoping he would tell me I was imagining things. But his face went pale as he watched it, and I knew he saw it too. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. We spent the rest of the day combing through every video Emily had sent us, analyzing each one with an obsessive intensity. At first, we found nothing. But then, in a video from 2 weeks earlier, there it was again, the same dark figure, standing in the corner of the living room, almost imperceptible but unmistakable once you knew what to look for. We were terrified. We didn't know what to do. Calling the police seemed pointless. They'd think we were crazy, or worse, accuse us of fabricating the footage. So we did the only thing we could think of. We installed cameras throughout the house, hidden in every room. We told Emily it was just for added security, that we wanted to keep an eye on the kids when we weren't home. She didn't seem bothered by it, didn't ask any questions. That night, after the kids were in bed, we watched the live feed from the cameras. At first, everything was quiet. The kids were asleep, the house was still, and I began to think maybe we were overreacting. But then, around midnight, I saw it, the figure, moving through the hallway outside the kids' room. It wasn't walking or gliding, it was just there, in one frame, then the next, closer to their door. Mark and I were frozen, staring at the screen in horror. The figure stopped outside Lily and Jacob's room, standing there for what felt like an eternity. I wanted to scream, to run upstairs and protect my children, but I was paralyzed with fear. Then, slowly, the door to their room creaked open. I could barely breathe as I watched the figure step inside, disappearing from the camera's view. We bolted upstairs, flinging open the door, but the room was empty. The kids were asleep, undisturbed, and there was no sign of anything unusual. But we knew what we had seen. For weeks, we lived in a state of constant fear, watching the cameras obsessively, but the figure never appeared again. Emily continued to babysit, none the wiser, and life went on. But the fear never left us. We never found out who or what the figure was. All we knew was that it was real, and it had been in our home. Eventually, we moved, hoping to leave whatever it was behind. But I still checked the cameras every night, waiting for that dark figure to reappear. And I wonder, how many other parents have seen something like this? How many have ignored that feeling of dread, dismissed it as paranoia, only to regret it later? So if you're watching this, check your cameras. Pay attention to the little things that seem off. Because sometimes, the monsters we fear aren't under the bed. They're standing right behind us, watching, waiting. And they might already be inside your home. My friends and I were huddled around a worn coffee table in our dorm's common room, the buzz of a Friday night drinking game gradually fading as the conversation turned to campus legends. There was one story that came up every year, a tale whispered about in hushed tones, room 404 in Patterson Hall. The room that didn't officially exist. Come on, it's just an empty storage room, I scoffed, trying to brush off the unnerving feeling that settled over us. Prove it, said Mark, his eyes gleaming with the challenge. Spend a night there. If you're so sure it's all fake, what's the harm? It was stupid, really, but I'd had just enough to drink to agree. How bad could it be? An old, unused room in a half-abandoned wing of the building? No big deal. I made my way to Patterson Hall around 11 p.m., armed with nothing but a sleeping bag and my phone. The hallways were deserted, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly above. Room 404 was located in a part of the building that had been cordoned off for renovations years ago. The wing was dark, colder than the rest of the dorms, and had a damp, musty smell. I hesitated when I reached the door, an old wooden thing with a peeling brass number, 404. I laughed at myself, nerves buzzing, and pushed the door open. The room was bare except for a rusted metal bed frame in the corner, and the floor was coated in a fine layer of dust. No signs of anything remotely out of the ordinary. I laid out my sleeping bag on the floor and settled in, determined to prove Mark and the others wrong. Midnight passed quietly, but as the clock neared 1 a.m., things began to change. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and I could see my breath in the air. The silence was thick, oppressive. Then I heard it, a soft scratching sound, like nails on wood, coming from behind the walls. I tried to ignore it at first, chalking it up to rats or old pipes, but the scratching grew louder, more insistent. It moved from one wall to the next, circling the room, always just out of sight. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up, scanning the dark corners of the room with my phone's flashlight. The beam flickered weakly, barely cutting through the darkness. Then, the door creaked open. I swear I had locked it behind me, but now it stood ajar, leading out into the pitch-black hallway. I called out, thinking one of my friends was playing a prank, but no one answered. The scratching stopped, replaced by a low, guttural sound, a growl, coming from the direction of the door. I stood frozen, listening to the growl deepen, growing louder and more menacing. My pulse thundered in my ears, and every instinct told me to run, but I couldn't move. I couldn't look away from the doorway. The growl escalated into a snarl, and I saw something, an outline, a shadow darker than the hallway itself. It was massive, hunched over, but there were no details, just a void in the shape of something inhuman. My phone slipped from my trembling hand, and I fell back, scrambling away from the door. The shadow didn't move, but the pressure in the room intensified, as if the air itself was trying to crush me. I could feel it watching me, something ancient and malevolent, something that had been trapped in that room for God knows how long. I bolted for the door, slamming it shut behind me, but I knew it wasn't enough. The scratching resumed, now more frantic, as if the thing was trying to claw its way through the walls. I ran down the hallway, heart racing, not daring to look back. My footsteps echoed through the empty corridors as I finally burst out into the cold night air, gasping for breath. I didn't stop running until I was back in my dorm room, locking the door behind me. My roommates were out for the night, and I was alone, but at least I was out of Patterson Hall. I spent the rest of the night huddled in bed, unable to sleep, every sound making me jump. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that it had been a hallucination, a trick of the mind. But when I returned to the common room, Mark was waiting for me, pale and shaken. He had a printout in his hand, something he had found in the campus archives. Room 404 had been sealed off for a reason. Decades ago, a student had been found dead in that room under circumstances the college refused to make public. The official cause of death was ruled a heart attack, but rumors spread that the student had been involved in some sort of ritual, something dark and forbidden. The room was sealed off and eventually forgotten as the years passed. I wanted to forget it too, but I couldn't. The memory of that night haunted me. The shadow's presence burned into my mind. I dropped out of college a few months later, unable to shake the sense of dread that followed me everywhere I went. I've never told anyone else about that night, not in detail. But I feel like I need to share this story, if only as a warning. There are things in this world we aren't meant to understand, things that exist in the shadows, waiting for someone foolish enough to open the door. And I was that fool. If you ever find yourself at Patterson Hall and someone dares you to spend the night in room 404, don't. Walk away and never look back. I still remember the day we moved into that house on Oakwood Drive, thinking it was a fresh start, a new beginning for our family. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where everyone kept their lawns trimmed and waved politely as you drove by. It was perfect, almost too perfect. But we never questioned it. How could we? It was everything we'd been searching for after years of saving and scraping by. But that was before the scratching began. It started subtly, barely noticeable at first. A faint noise, almost like the rustling of leaves against the window. At night, when the house was silent, I'd lie in bed, straining to hear it over the soft breathing of my husband, Michael, beside me. I would convince myself it was just my imagination, or perhaps a raccoon scratching around outside. But as the nights passed, it grew louder, more persistent, until it seemed to be coming from inside the walls. Michael never heard it. He was a deep sleeper, oblivious to the disturbances that kept me awake, tossing and turning in the dark. But I could feel something was wrong. It wasn't just the noise, it was the way the air felt heavier, thicker with every passing day, as if something unseen was slowly wrapping itself around the house. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the mundane tasks of daily life. The kids needed to get to school, laundry had to be done, and meals cooked. But the scratching wouldn't let me forget. I started noticing other things too, little things that were easy to dismiss at first. Objects would be in different places than where I had left them. Doors I was certain I had closed would be open, and then there was the cold. A sudden chill that would sweep through the room, leaving goosebumps on my arms. One night, after a particularly long day, I collapsed into bed, determined to finally get some sleep. But the scratching came almost immediately, louder than ever, as if whatever was making the noise was right next to me, just on the other side of the wall. I held my breath, my heart pounding, as the sound grew more frantic, like nails dragging across the drywall. Then, abruptly, it stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I waited, tense, for what felt like an eternity. And then I heard it, a low, guttural growl emanating from the wall behind our headboard. It wasn't human, wasn't animal. It was something else entirely. I shot up in bed, my body trembling as I shook Michael awake. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice shaking. He groaned, barely opening his eyes. "It's probably just the pipes, babe. Go back to sleep." But I knew it wasn't the pipes. It was something far worse, something I couldn't explain. For the first time, I felt a sense of dread that I couldn't shake, a deep, primal fear that gnawed at my insides. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening, but the noise didn't return. Not that night, at least. The next morning, I decided I couldn't ignore it any longer. I needed to know what was causing the noise, what was hiding behind those walls. Michael was at work, and the kids were at school, so I had the house to myself. I grabbed a flashlight and a hammer, my hands shaking as I approached the wall where I'd heard the growl. The logical part of my brain screamed at me to stop, to leave it alone, but I couldn't. I had to know. I knocked on the wall, listening for anything out of the ordinary. Nothing. I knocked again, harder this time, and still nothing. I was about to give up, feeling foolish, when I noticed something odd. The wall sounded hollow, but only in one spot. The rest of it was solid, but there was a small section, maybe a foot wide, that echoed with each tap. My heart raced as I raised the hammer, hesitating for just a moment before bringing it down on the drywall. The plaster cracked and crumbled away, revealing a dark, narrow space behind it. I shone the flashlight into the hole, peering inside, but all I could see was darkness. The light barely penetrated the void, but something caught my eye, a glint of metal deep within the wall. I reached in, my fingers brushing against something cold and smooth. I pulled it out, holding it up to the light. It was an old, rusty key, heavy in my hand. My heart skipped a beat as I examined it, trying to make sense of why it would be hidden inside the wall. But before I could ponder further, a sudden noise behind me made me jump. I spun around, the flashlight beam shaking as it swept across the room. The door to the bedroom was ajar, even though I was certain I'd closed it. And then, there it was again, the scratching, coming from the floor this time, right beneath my feet. It was louder now, more insistent, as if whatever was making the noise was trying desperately to break through. Panic surged through me. I backed away, clutching the key tightly as the noise grew louder and louder, almost deafening. The floorboards beneath me began to creak, the wood splintering as if something was pushing up from below. I couldn't stay in that room any longer. I ran, nearly tripping over myself as I stumbled down the stairs and out of the house. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air, my mind racing. I called Michael, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely dial his number. He answered on the second ring, his voice calm, unaware of the terror that had just unfolded. I found something, I said, my voice trembling. There's something in the house, Michael. We need to leave. What are you talking about? He asked, sounding concerned but not yet alarmed. There's something in the walls, I whispered, as if saying it out loud would make it more real. I found a key, and there's scratching. I can't explain it, but we have to go. He tried to reassure me, told me he'd be home soon and that everything would be okay. But I knew it wouldn't be. I could feel it, that thing lurking just beneath the surface, waiting. The key burned in my hand as I clutched it, a part of me terrified to let it go, while another part of me wanted to throw it as far away as possible. When Michael finally got home, we searched the house together, but the scratching had stopped, and there were no signs of anything unusual. It was as if the house itself was mocking me, hiding its secrets just out of reach. But I knew what I had heard, what I had felt. That key was a warning, a message that something was very wrong. And then, one night, while we were lying in bed, the scratching returned. But this time, it wasn't just a noise. The floorboards beneath our bed began to shake, the bed itself vibrating as if something was pushing up from below. Michael finally heard it, his eyes wide with fear as he grabbed my hand. We bolted out of bed, grabbing the kids and running out of the house as fast as we could. We never went back. I still have that key, though I've never dared to use it. Some doors are better left unopened. And some things, once let out, can never be put back. The first time I felt it, I was sure I was dreaming. I lay there, unable to move, paralyzed in the dead of night, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might burst through my chest. My eyes looked around the room, but the darkness swallowed everything, except the dim form of my husband, Tom, sleeping beside me. Then I saw it. A dark figure in the corner of our bedroom, its shape shifting and twisting as if it were made of shadows. It didn't have a face, just an outline, but I could feel its presence, heavy and suffocating. It moved closer, and I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was trapped in my own body, unable to wake up or cry out. That was the first night. By the time the sun rose, I was exhausted and shaken, but I convinced myself it was just a nightmare. Tom brushed it off as stress and lack of sleep. But then it happened again. And again. Each night, it became more serious. The figure in the corner became more defined, more menacing. It would approach my bed, its presence so oppressive I could hardly breathe. It was as if it fed on my fear. The paralysis was always the same, an inescapable grip that left me helpless and terrified. I started keeping a journal, documenting each episode. I noted the time, what I saw, and how I felt. Patterns began to emerge. The figure always appeared when I was alone, usually in the middle of the night. It was like a relentless predator, stalking me in my most vulnerable state. I shared my experiences with Tom, but he struggled to understand. Sleep paralysis, he said. It's a common phenomenon. It can feel real, but it's just a trick of the mind. But I knew it was more. One night, as I lay frozen in bed, the figure loomed closer than ever before. I felt a pressure on my chest, as if invisible hands were squeezing the life out of me. I struggled to breathe, my vision narrowing to a pinpoint. The figure reached out and touched my face. The sensation was ice cold, and I felt a rush of panic so intense it was almost unbearable. In a desperate attempt to find answers, I consulted a sleep specialist. After describing my symptoms, he diagnosed me with severe sleep paralysis, exacerbated by stress and anxiety. He suggested lifestyle changes and prescribed medication to help manage my symptoms. I hoped it would be enough to end the nightmare. But the episodes didn't stop. They continued, each one more terrifying than the last. I began to dread going to sleep, knowing what awaited me. I took every precaution, keeping lights on, sleeping with the TV on, even moving to the guest bedroom. Nothing worked. The figure followed me, creeping into my dreams and my waking moments. One night, I woke up in the guest room to find the figure standing at the foot of the bed. My heart raced as I tried to move, but my body was once again paralyzed. The figure began to speak, its voice a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down my spine. "You can't escape," it said. "I will always be here." The words echoed in my mind as I struggled to break free from the paralysis. When I finally managed to move, I found myself drenched in sweat, my body trembling uncontrollably. I knew I couldn't take much more. In a final bid for relief, I reached out to a therapist specializing in trauma and anxiety. I described my experiences in detail, and she listened intently. She suggested that my experiences might be tied to a deeply ingrained fear or unresolved trauma. As we dug deeper into my past, I remembered an incident from my childhood that I had long buried, a near-drowning incident that left me with a profound fear of being trapped and powerless. The therapist helped me confront these fears, working through techniques to manage anxiety and stress. Gradually, the intensity of the episodes diminished. I learned to control my breathing and refocus my mind during the episodes. The figure became less frequent and less menacing. Then, one night, I had a breakthrough. I was lying in bed, fully expecting the figure to appear. But this time, when it did, I faced it head-on. I focused all my energy on it, willing it to disappear. And it did. The shadowy figure dissolved into the darkness, leaving me free to move and breathe. The relief was profound. For the first time in months, I slept peacefully through the night. The figure never returned. To this day, I still have moments of fear when I'm alone at night. But I've learned to manage them, and the nightmares are a distant memory. The experience left me with a deep understanding of the power of the mind and the importance of confronting one's deepest fears. I shared my story with Tom, and while he never fully understood the depths of my experience, he supported me through it all. The house has become a place of healing rather than terror, a testament to the strength of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable fear. The man in the shadows may have haunted my nights, but facing him taught me that even the darkest fears can be overcome with the right tools and support. My wife, Lisa, always had this weird habit of whispering to herself in the dead of night. I'd wake up to find her muttering softly, sometimes crying out in fear. I thought it was stress because we were dealing with a lot at the time. But everything changed one fateful night that left us questioning our sanity and our safety. It started 3 months ago. We'd recently moved into an old house on the outskirts of town, a place we could finally call our own. The previous owners had left in a hurry, but we were too excited about the space and the price to care. The first few weeks were a blur of unpacking and settling in. That was until Lisa's nightly whispers began. It was around midnight when I first noticed her standing by the window in the dark. I went to her, gently shaking her awake. She looked at me with confusion, claiming she had no memory of being up at all. I thought she was just sleepwalking and didn't think much of it. But it kept happening. One night, I found her in the basement, sitting on the cold concrete floor, speaking in a language I didn't recognize. Her eyes were wide, almost lifeless, and she seemed to be in a trance. I called out to her, but it took several minutes before she snapped out of it, claiming she was just trying to organize some old boxes. Things escalated quickly. We started hearing strange noises, scratching, whispering, and footsteps when no one else was around. I told Lisa it was just the house settling, but I began to doubt my own words. We even had the place inspected, but nothing out of the ordinary was found. One evening, as Lisa and I were having dinner, our 6-year-old son, Max, came running into the room. His face was pale, and his voice trembled as he said, "Mommy, there's a monster in the basement." I tried to comfort him, telling him it was just his imagination, but his fear was palpable. That night, after Max was tucked in bed, I decided to check the basement myself. The light bulb flickered as I descended the stairs, and an unsettling coldness enveloped me. I was about to turn back when I heard Lisa's voice echoing from the far end of the basement. I crept closer, finding her huddled in the corner, speaking to what seemed like an empty space. Her eyes were fixated on something unseen, and she was crying uncontrollably. "Lisa, what's wrong?" I asked, my voice shaking. She looked at me, her eyes filled with terror. "It's trying to get to Max," she whispered. "It's angry because of what we've done." I tried to calm her down, but the more I spoke, the more agitated she became. I finally managed to get her upstairs and back to bed. I stayed up that night, watching over Max and Lisa, feeling a growing sense of dread. The next day, things took a turn for the worse. Max started having nightmares, screaming in his sleep about shadowy figures and dark voices. Lisa's behavior became increasingly erratic. She would snap at me for no reason, often looking over her shoulder as if expecting someone to be there. Then came the night of the confrontation. It was Lisa's birthday, and we had planned a small family celebration. Max seemed unusually quiet, and Lisa was on edge. During dinner, Lisa suddenly stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Her eyes were locked onto something behind me, her face twisted in fear. Without warning, she began to scream, "It's here! It's here!" I spun around, but saw nothing. I rushed to her, trying to calm her down, but she was beyond reasoning. The room grew colder, and the lights flickered. Max began to cry, and the shadows in the room seemed to grow darker. I was losing control of the situation, and Lisa's behavior became more frantic. In a desperate attempt to understand what was happening, I reached out to a local historian who specialized in the area's history. He told me the house had once belonged to a family that was rumored to have been involved in dark rituals. According to him, the family had vanished mysteriously, and there were whispers of a demonic presence tied to the property. I didn't want to believe it, but the historian's words echoed in my mind. That night, I made the decision to confront the situation head-on. I set up a camera in the basement, hoping to capture any strange occurrences. What I saw on the footage was horrifying. Lisa was in the basement again, but this time, she wasn't alone. The camera captured her speaking to an unseen entity, her body language twisted in a way that was both disturbing and unnatural. At one point, the shadows in the basement seemed to move on their own, taking on a menacing form. I could see Lisa's reflection in the basement window, her eyes dark and empty. The next morning, I packed our things and moved out of the house. We stayed with relatives for a while, and Lisa's behavior slowly returned to normal. We eventually sought therapy, and Lisa underwent treatment for what was diagnosed as a severe case of dissociation. To this day, I still don't fully understand what happened in that house. Lisa has no memory of her actions, and Max has blocked out most of the traumatic events. The house has since been sold, and I've heard rumors that new occupants have reported strange occurrences. But I know one thing for certain: whatever was in that basement, it was not of this world. And it left a mark on our family that we'll never forget. I should have known something was off when I found the package on our doorstep. It was a plain, brown box, wrapped in twine, with no return address. My girlfriend, Sarah, had been away on a business trip, so I assumed it was for her. When I opened the box, I found an old, leather-bound journal. The pages were yellowed and filled with scribbles in a shaky hand. There were drawings of what looked like our house and disturbing notes about the girl in the mirror. I showed the journal to Sarah when she came back, but she brushed it off as a prank. We didn't think much of it until strange things started happening. At first, it was small things, objects moving from one place to another, the occasional cold spot in the house. Then, Sarah began to see strange shadows in the corners of her vision, and she would hear faint whispers when she was alone. I tried to reassure her that it was just stress, but I couldn't ignore the unease growing in the pit of my stomach. One evening, while Sarah was taking a bath, I heard a loud thud from the bathroom. When I rushed in, Sarah was standing in front of the mirror, drenched and trembling. She was staring at the mirror, her eyes wide with terror. The mirror was fogged up, and on it was written in a child's scrawl, "I'm coming for you." I immediately thought it was some sort of sick joke, but Sarah was convinced something was wrong. We tried to get rid of the journal, but it kept reappearing in the house, no matter how many times we threw it away. Things escalated when Sarah began receiving disturbing phone calls. The caller would never say anything, just breathe heavily. She was petrified, and I was running out of explanations. One night, Sarah woke me up in a panic. She claimed she had seen someone, or something, watching her from the window. I checked outside, but there was no one there. The paranoia was starting to affect both of us. Then came the night that broke us. We were having dinner when we heard a knock at the door. Sarah opened it to find another package, identical to the first one. This time, it contained a photograph of our bedroom taken from inside the room while we were asleep. Sarah was beside herself. We decided to investigate the journal further. It was filled with entries about a man who had lived in the house before us. He had been obsessed with a girl who looked like Sarah, believing she was being haunted by a malevolent spirit. The journal ended abruptly with a final entry that simply read, "She's here." I couldn't save her. Desperate for answers, we contacted the previous owner's relatives. They revealed that the man had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and the house had been abandoned for years before we moved in. We decided to leave the house immediately. Sarah and I packed up and moved to a new place, but the trauma stayed with us. The journal was left behind, and the unsettling feeling never really went away. To this day, Sarah avoids mirrors and won't answer the phone if she doesn't recognize the number. We never found out who sent the package or what was really behind the strange occurrences, and we were lucky to escape with our lives. I never believed in curses until the day I found the blood-stained note under my daughter's pillow. It was supposed to be a regular Wednesday evening. My husband, David, and I were in the middle of settling into our new home, a charming house that was supposed to be a fresh start for our family. Our daughter, Lily, had been acting strangely for weeks, retreating into her room more often, and her once vibrant laughter had faded into an eerie silence. We chalked it up to the stress of moving, but that evening changed everything. After tucking Lily into bed, I was cleaning up when I noticed her bedroom door slightly ajar. I went in to check on her one last time before heading downstairs. That's when I saw it, a small, folded piece of paper peeking out from under her pillow. My heart raced as I pulled it out. The note read, "They're coming for you." I saw them. I immediately asked Lily about the note, but she looked at me with wide, terrified eyes and shook her head. She couldn't explain it, and neither could I. David and I tried to stay calm, dismissing it as a product of her imagination, but that didn't explain the unsettling feeling that had settled in the pit of my stomach. Later that night, I heard noises coming from Lily's room, whispers, shuffling footsteps. David and I tiptoed up the stairs, only to find Lily's room empty. She was gone. Panic set in as we searched the house, only to find her sitting in the attic, clutching a dusty old book. Her eyes were glazed over, and she muttered incoherently about the people who wanted her. The attic was filled with old family relics, but the book was different. It was bound in cracked leather and had symbols etched into its cover. When David opened it, the pages were filled with strange diagrams and words that seemed to pulse with an unsettling energy. Lily's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She would whisper to invisible friends and claim to see shadowy figures lurking in the corners of the house. Desperate for answers, we sought help from experts, but they found nothing unusual, no hidden messages, no signs of tampering. Yet, the atmosphere in the house was growing heavier, almost oppressive. One night, after Lily's fourth visit to the attic, she came downstairs with a grim expression. She handed me another note, written in the same shaky handwriting as before. They want her. The curse is real. In a desperate attempt to save our daughter, we decided to investigate the history of the house. We discovered that the previous owners had experienced similar disturbances. An old newspaper article revealed that the original inhabitants of the house had vanished mysteriously, leaving behind their possessions and a chillingly similar book. The more we uncovered, the more we realized that the strange occurrences weren't merely psychological, but had a dark pattern. The house seemed to carry a dark legacy, and Lily was its latest victim. We had to make a choice, stay and risk our family's safety or leave everything behind. We packed our bags and left that night, abandoning the house and its ominous secrets. Lily's condition improved after we moved, but the memories of those weeks linger. The book was left behind, but the fear of what it contains still haunts us. I've always been a skeptic, the type to laugh off ghost stories and roll my eyes at real demon videos online. That all changed on the night I found my sister's camera in the woods, just hours after she disappeared. It was late summer, the air thick with humidity as my brother and I searched through the thick forest behind our house. She hadn't been gone long, just enough for worry to turn into fear. My sister, Ella, was never the type to vanish without a trace, especially not in the middle of the night. We called out her name, our voices swallowed by the trees. Then, as if the forest itself was guiding me, I spotted something glinting under a thick layer of leaves. It was her camera, an old DSLR she never went anywhere without. I picked it up, feeling a cold dread settle in my chest. The lens was cracked, and there were deep scratches all over the body, but it was still functional. My brother and I exchanged a look. It was strange enough that she'd leave it behind, but the damage suggested something far more disturbing. Back at the house, I couldn't shake the sense of unease. My hands trembled as I powered on the camera and started scrolling through the photos. They were the usual series of random photos, mostly of the woods, taken earlier that day. But then, the pictures took a strange turn. The first strange image was a blurred shot, as if the camera had been snatched from her hands. Then came a series of rapid-fire photos of the ground, leaves, and branches. Finally, there was a single frame that made my blood run cold, a photo of Ella's wide, terrified eyes staring directly into the lens, her mouth open in a scream. The background was pitch black, as if the light had been swallowed by the darkness around her. I hit play on the last video. The screen flickered for a moment, then stabilized. The image was shaky, the camera pointing haphazardly at the ground as Ella's breathless voice whispered, "I don't know what's happening. If someone finds this, please." A loud crack echoed through the speakers, and the camera whipped around, capturing a flash of something moving between the trees. My heart raced as I strained to make out the shape. It was too quick, too shadowy, but it was there. The camera jerked wildly, as if she was running. Then, abruptly, it stopped. The screen was still for a moment, pointed at a clearing I didn't recognize. There was no sound, just the faint rustling of leaves. And then, out of the darkness, a figure stepped into view. It was a man, or at least, that's what it looked like at first. He was tall, his body unnaturally rigid, and his face obscured by the shadows. But something was wrong with him. The way he moved was unsettling, like he wasn't entirely human. His limbs jerked with a mechanical stiffness, and his head twitched as if he were trying to shake something off. He stared directly into the camera, his eyes hollow, devoid of life. Ella's voice, trembling, whispered, "Who are you?" There was no response. The man took a step closer, and that's when I saw it. His shadow didn't align with his body. It moved independently, writhing on the ground like a living thing. Ella screamed, and the camera fell, landing in the dirt. The video ended there. We called the police, but when they searched the area where I found the camera, they came up empty. No footprints, no signs of a struggle, nothing. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. The officers assured us they would keep looking, but the looks on their faces told me they didn't expect to find her alive. Weeks turned into months, and the search was eventually called off. My family was left to pick up the pieces, but I couldn't let it go. I became obsessed with that video, replaying it over and over, trying to understand what I had seen. The man's face, the unnatural way he moved, the shadow that seemed to have a mind of its own, it haunted my every waking moment. Then, one night, as I was staring at the paused video, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. In the frame just before the camera dropped, there was something etched into the bark of a tree behind the man. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a symbol carved deep into the wood. A spiral with lines radiating outward like the arms of some ancient creature. I grabbed a flashlight and headed into the woods, following the path Ella had taken in her last moments. I knew it was insane, but I had to know. I had to see if the symbol was really there, if any of it made sense. When I reached the clearing, I felt it before I saw it, a cold, oppressive force that made the hairs on my neck stand up. My flashlight flickered as I scanned the trees, and then I saw it. The symbol was there, carved deep into the trunk of a gnarled oak. Just beneath it, the bark was stained with something dark and dried, blood, or something far worse. As I stared at the symbol, a shadow fell over me as the air grew cold. I turned, slowly, and there he was, standing just a few feet away. The man from the video, his eyes hollow, his movements jerky and unnatural. But it wasn't just him, it was the shadow, writhing and twisting at his feet, like a creature trying to break free. I don't remember much after that. Just a blur of motion, of cold hands grabbing me, of that twisted, inhuman face coming closer and closer. I must have passed out, because when I woke up, I was back at the house, the camera clutched in my hands. The symbol was gone from the video. The man's face was a blur, and the shadow had vanished entirely. The only thing that remained was Ella's scream, echoing in my mind. I don't know what happened to my sister. I don't know what that thing was, or why it came for her. But I know this, it's still out there, somewhere in those woods, waiting. And every time I close my eyes, I see it coming for me.